So this is Enterprise Open Source How-To. I'm Doug Ireton. I have been working in IT since 1993 when I interned at Microsoft. And 22 years at large companies. So that's basically all my career minus 1 year where I worked at a small university. I've worked at large enterprise companies. And I'm on day 4 of my new job at One Strategy. We're an AWS and co-ops consultancy, helping companies move applications to the cloud. So this talk was accepted while I was still working at Nordstrom. So this talk is based on my time at Nordstrom, where I was a senior chef engineer. And I was also sort of the unofficial open source czar. So when people had questions about open source or GitHub or which license to use, they would come to me. And pretty soon, I was choosing a license for the company without legal being involved. So we'll get to that. So I helped application teams navigate open source licenses. I shepherded the corporate contributor license agreements for Facebook and for Google through contract review and leadership approval. I also helped teams to successfully contribute to projects like Chef, Facebook's React.js, and Kubernetes, and Docker, among others. So I thought I'd start with a little bit of our open source history. So for enterprises who don't contribute to open source, is there who's here that you don't have an official I can contribute to open source thing? Okay, fair number of people. Good. Okay. So for enterprises who don't contribute to open source, the reasons why they don't contribute are mostly cultural and political. And culture change takes a lot of time. So it took Nordstrom almost 4 years to go from open source contributions are allowed to open source is the default approach for fast-moving app teams. And certainly not every app team at Nordstrom is using all open source. We still use a lot of enterprise software. We still pay for a lot of software. But for the majority of fast-moving app teams, especially app teams in the cloud, they're pretty much all using open source all the time. It's a 4-year journey. So we'll start back in 2008 when I started at Nordstrom. We were using Red Hat, which is technically open source because it uses a Linux kernel, but it doesn't feel like an open source operating system, really. We certainly didn't go to conferences, and we certainly did not contribute to open source. In spring of 2012, we bought Chef, and that was sort of our first sort of real open source tool. In fall of 2012, our VP said, contributing to open source is part of using open source. So set that expectation out there that if you're using open source, part of that is contributing. Now that didn't mean that everyone started contributing the next day, but it certainly set the tone. And I think that tone of leadership is pretty required. And then employees were asked to sign an IP agreement. Presumably when you started at your company, you signed an intellectual property agreement. It basically just says, what you do for the company belongs to the company. So pretty straightforward. So in 2015, open source was allowed, but getting a corporate contributor license agreement signed was a major pain. It took 4 months to get the Facebook CCLA approved. So we had a dev team, and they were using React.js, and they had a performance fix for React.js. They would significantly speed up our website. But they couldn't contribute it because Facebook requires that you sign a corporate contributors license agreement. And so getting that through sort of legal approval and leadership approval took a long time, took 4 months. So I'm going to take a little side journey to explain what a CCLA is if you're not familiar. Here's how Google explains theirs, which I think they do a really good job of it. So it basically says, when you're contributing, you give Google the legal permission to use and distribute your contribution. You do not surrender ownership of your contribution, and you do not give up any of your rights to use your contribution elsewhere. If your company owns the intellectual property you wish to contribute, then we must have a corporate contributors license agreement on file for your company. So someone at your company needs to sign that agreement that says you're giving this contribution. It also spells out that you have the right to give this. You're not stealing it from some other company. You're not stealing it from your company. You have the right to contribute this patch. You wrote this. You're the owner of it. You authored it, and you're able to contribute it. So we've had, during this 4-month process, we had devs come to us and say, can I just sign the individual contributor's license agreement? It'll be super fast. I can get it done in 5 minutes. And we said, I said no. Like, no, you can't do that because you're contributing. You're working for Nordstrom, and Nordstrom needs to sign that contributor's license agreement. So we'll talk about that more a little bit later. So finally, fast forward to 2016. Open source is now the default for fast-moving app teams. And notice I said fast-moving app teams, not the slow-moving app teams, because we have some of those. But because I had the relationship with our contract team, the Google CCLA was signed in a week. So just having, I think that sort of a digression is that those relationships are key. Adam Jacob in his talk last year said, it's good to form diverse bonds. And what he's talking about is you're going to need those relationships with leadership. You're going to need those relationships with the contract approval people. You'll need those relationships with legal to get things done. And this is a classic example of you need something done that you cannot do on your own as an engineer. And you need help from other people, and you need to convince them it's a good idea, right? So just to recap, 4 years from open source is allowed, we're allowed to contribute, to it's expected that you will use open source, and we're sort of open source first for most things, not for all things. But just that the takeaway here is that culture change is hard and it's slow. So we talked about our 4-year journey, but let's talk about why companies use open source in the first place. So this is from the Black Duck software. They're a vendor that does open source security scanning. Black Duck software, they have a future of open source survey they do every year. So for 2016, these are the top reasons that companies use open source. It's quality of solutions, competitive features, and ability to customize and fix. But these are words on a slide. I think the best illustration is to look at a couple of products that have been closed source and then made open source, and we'll see the difference here is the first one. So this is GitHub's Atom Editor. It started out as a closed source project by GitHub. They were paying people to write it. They had a team of people dedicated to the editor. And then, and this is from one of their blog posts here. I didn't actually write that on the slide. That was in the blog post there. But you can see that, it's not necessary to really understand everything about the graph, except this is just, these are contributions, these are pushes, these are pull requests, these are comments on issues. So you see a huge jump here when they open sourced it. That is a lot of that's engineering hours and talent going into this product and making it better. Even though GitHub was paying a team of engineers to work on it, and I'm sure those folks are super smart, they just didn't have the bandwidth that you get when you open source something. Here's a more dramatic example. This is Microsoft's Roslyn C# compiler platform, their compiler platform. You can see like basically flat line there until they open sourced it, and then a huge jump. Obviously there's a huge interest in that compiler platform. Even though Microsoft had a team of paid people, so you can think about it like your enterprise vendor has a team of paid people who are paid to work on something, right? This is just another example of when you open source something, all of that benefit that you get for free, basically. So let's talk about some benefits that we saw at Nordstrom for using open source. So using new software no longer requires a 3-month negotiation process. You just download it and you start using it, right? Open source, I think the thing that, as I've been in the open source community a long time, it really sunk in that open source is written by engineers for engineers, right? If your enterprise vendor, they have engineers, but they're not necessarily using it, they're just writing it. And all of those requirements are being translated through layers of salespeople and management and things like that, right? So at Nordstrom, app teams that are using open source tend to deploy weekly or daily because in general, open source tools are meant to be automated. So if you look at a lot of enterprise vendor tools that we've looked at, they're not meant to be automated. There's a GUI, you clicky, you drag, and that's how you get your orchestration and your automation. Open source tools are typically meant to be automated, so they're designed differently from the ground up. So you can deploy faster and you can move more quickly. Also lets you control your destiny. I think that's kind of the main thing. We'll have some examples here. So again, this is from the Black Duck Future of Open Source survey this year. So why do companies participate in open source? Why do they contribute? So fix bugs or add functionality to gain a competitive advantage, which I thought was an interesting one. So these are in order. Like the number one reason was to fix bugs and add functionality, but number two was to gain a competitive advantage over their competitors who are not using open source. And then to reduce development costs. So as an example, a few years ago I was working on an identity management project from a major enterprise vendor. And there was a bug in the software that was preventing us from rolling it out. And we said, hey, there's a bug. We reported the bug. We gave them steps to reproduce the bug. They said, well, it's in our backlog. It'll be about 6 months. Maybe we can get to it next quarter, right? Has anyone experienced that, right? Yeah, that's not uncommon. So, enterprise software, bugs may be prioritized by how much money you're giving them. I think the other thing is that in enterprise software, they are driven by customers paying them money, and they may just throw in every feature that every person wants who's paying them 6 figures, right? You're going to tell the customer no, you're just going to throw the feature in, so you end up with bloated products, right? So compare that to open source. We found a bug in supermarket, our internal supermarket server. And on March 3rd of 2015, my coworker opened an issue. I fixed it and submitted a pull request. It was merged the same day. I didn't have to fight Chef and say, can you please prioritize this bug? It's blocking us and whatever. I just fixed it. And I submitted a PR, and it got merged, and everyone was happy, right? So open source has become ubiquitous. It's the way that more and more companies, the majority of companies, are now operating. So per the Future of Open Source survey, 65% of companies surveyed contribute to open source in some way. So another major reason is hiring, is attracting and retaining top talent. So this is from, the DICE and Linux open source jobs report this year. Companies are looking to increase hiring, no surprise. 59% of managers are looking to increase open source hiring for open source talent. But it's hard to find, as I'm sure you know. 87% say it's hard to find open source talent. Does anyone here have trouble finding talented engineers? Yeah. Half of open source focused employees are given incentives in the past year to prevent them from switching jobs. And 73% were contacted by a recruiter at least once in the past 6 months. So who's been here has been contacted by a recruiter in the past year? Yeah, lots of people. And 86% believe their open source skills have advanced their careers. So all of this open source contributing, this creates a virtuous loop. I love this quote from the ThoughtWorks blog. Opening up their software tools to the public, companies advertise their tech credibility and can better compete for top talent. In turn, these talented programmers drive innovation at their employers, improving their open source platforms and creating new open source and closing that virtuous loop. We've certainly seen that at Nordstrom. I think one of our successes that I'm most happy about is that we hired the co-founder of Chef Software. because Nordstrom has a good reputation in the open source community. We participate in open source, we go to conferences, we contribute to open source. So we were able to hire Nathan Haney-Smith. We would not have been able to hire him if we did not allow open source contributions. So many folks we interview have looked at our GitHub org before the interview. They've seen what we've contributed to, and they say, that's a place I want to go work, because they're doing cool stuff, and they are participating in open source. So I did this little poll on Twitter, which I'm just going to let that sink in for a little bit. I asked, I would be willing to work for a company which didn't allow open source contributions. So this is fairly popular. I got 167 votes. So 68% of people disagreed with that statement. So if you were not allowing open source contributions, you're losing out on more than 2/3 of talented engineers. I'm not sure what the 25% in the middle of the neutral is. They're like maybe, but maybe not. But only 7% agreed with this statement. Only 7%. So if you are not contributing to open source, you're not embracing open source, your hiring pool is very small. So we'll move on to some guidelines here. So at Nordstrom, leadership approval is required. We'll talk about that. So when you contribute, you're acting on behalf of your company in public. So at Nordstrom, senior director approval was required for open source contributions to new projects. Doesn't mean that the senior director is on every pull request. It just means, so in our example, with chef cookbooks, we went to our senior director and we had a conversation. We said, hey, we want to contribute to chef cookbooks, and we had a conversation about why we needed to do that and why that's beneficial and why it helps Nordstrom and why that's good for the business. And then he said, sounds good. And then that was really about it. So we didn't have to go to him with every pull request to every chef cookbook. He just knew that, hey, we have authority to contribute to chef cookbooks. Now when something else like React.js came up, or Kubernetes or Docker, there was another, about a 5-minute conversation and maybe an email follow-up. So it just sort of keeps leadership in the loop and also sort of raises visibility that open source is important and we're doing great stuff. Yes?
Was the senior director, at least at Nordstrom's, was that within the IT org, or was that on the business side?
Not on the business side, in the IT org, yeah. The business cared about selling shoes, they didn't care about open source, just to be honest. Okay, so intellectual property agreement, you need one. So you probably already signed one, or you have one, so this is probably not a discussion we need to go deep on. It just clarifies the work that you do for the company belongs to the company. It's fairly straightforward. So if you have any doubt about that, you can talk to your HR people. So licenses is probably a big discussion. I'm not going to go super deep. I'm not a lawyer. I'm an engineer. So what I thought I would do is just go to choose a license, because I think it's a really good site. We chose Apache 2 for all of our projects that we open sourced. So this is when you're maintaining a project, we chose Apache 2. I had an extensive conversation, actually several conversations with Chef's lawyer, Jennifer DeMoss, about licenses, and we talked about Apache 2. So I think this is a really good, oh, it's not over there. That's a problem. Like, you can't see what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is choosing an open source license. It kind of walks you through, you talk about, hey, these are the things that I want, and then you can, this is hard doing the mouse on some other screen. So we'll see how successful I will be. There we go. So we chose Apache 2. So it's nice because it kind of gives you these 3 columns here, and it makes it pretty straightforward. This would be a good resource if your lawyer has questions about which license to pick. So it talks about permissions, conditions, and what's the other limitations? Yeah. So the thing that I liked about Apache 2 was the trademark use. So basically this protects your brand as a company. It means that people who fork your project and create a derivative work can't use your brand. So that seemed pretty important since we have our brand recognition is pretty important. So that's why we chose Apache 2. I just sort of a side story on that. I think that one of the challenges is that I didn't have a relationship with legal. So I had a relationship, I knew a VP and I was friends with him, and he had a good relationship with legal. And so, but he was super busy. I was trying to get his time, and I sort of explained this. I wanted to go to legal and get their official blessing, but he's like, you can't go to legal directly because they don't know you, and they'll just ignore you. And so I tried to work through him, and then he retired. So eventually I just picked a license. I picked Apache 2, and that became our license. And I sort of asked forgiveness, not permission, kind of a thing. Our legal department is concerned with contracts with suppliers and things like that. They're not focused on open source. So maybe that will change in the future, but I knew that we had leadership approval to contribute to open source. And so people were asking me what license to pick, so I had to pick something. So in some cases, you're not going to have this perfectly tied up in a bow arrangement with your legal team. So it's probably best to go to your leadership with that if you have questions or whatever. So, but I knew that leadership would back me, so it wasn't super risky. Okay, let's go back here. So choosealicense.com is what I would recommend to go to help you pick a license. There's a lot of information out there and a lot of misinformation about licenses. In general, we wanted to stay away from GPL-based licenses because we wanted to, as a company, we cared sort of less about free and open source sort of purity and more about having as many people benefit from our open source as possible. So a GitHub org, so when you work for a company, the work you do belongs to the company. And when you contribute code, you are doing that on behalf of the company. Your GitHub org is your company's open source resume. Sorry. Oh, thank you. Sorry. I will just, okay, now I have to get back. Oh, thank you. Okay, did we get, yeah, okay. So your GitHub org is your company's open source resume, and it should reflect your company branding. So when people go to Nordstrom on GitHub, they should see the Nordstrom logo, and you can see we have our tagline right here. So this is the public face of your company on GitHub, so make it look good. And one of the things that we talked about with engineers at Nordstrom a lot is, hey, when you're gonna, you want to contribute to a third-party project, maybe you're contributing to Kubernetes or contributing to Docker or whatever, fork that repo into the Nordstrom org so that when people go visit the Nordstrom org on GitHub, they see that repo. They see that engineers are working on Kubernetes or Docker or Chef or whatever. So personal stuff you can keep in your own personal GitHub username, but as far as company work on company time, you should fork that into the Nordstrom GitHub org. So, and then one other thing we talked about before is that you should get the corporate contributor license agreement signed and approved by your leadership, and don't sign the individual contributors license agreement. Okay. So briefly, some help for maintainers. This is not really a maintainer-focused talk. I have a couple of articles which I will attempt to open. Then we can't see that. Just a second, let me drag it over here. Two really good articles that I've found and I will tweet these, and then they'll be in the slides, of course, as well. So this is a list apart. It's all the things that you need when you're contributing. So let's scroll up here. So what do they talk about? Sorry, I can't see it now. Anyway, that's a really good article, and there's another one in opensource.com. So there. Okay, there we go. So just tips for new GitHub projects. So making sure that you have a code of conduct and a contributing guide to how to contribute, and what kind of bugs you will, or what kind of fixes or pull requests you'll take, and things like that. So Okay, there we go. So help for maintainers. Pretty limited, but it'll be, I'll tweet it out and it'll be in the slides as well. So in summary, open source and contributing open source allows you to move quickly. You get control of your destiny as an engineering org. It helps you attract and retain top talent. And guardrails like a license and leadership approval protect your intellectual property. And also, I think when we didn't have those, it was confusing to people who were not sort of experienced open source experts. They didn't know like which license to pick, and they didn't know how to contribute. They didn't know how to do a pull request. So I think having those sort of guidelines, like yes, we encourage you to do open source within these sort of boundaries, and you need to go talk to your senior director and get approval. That accelerated contributions because it made it easy for people. They knew exactly what to do. So recommend that. So ultimately, open source changes your culture. So developers communicating primarily through code, using tools such as GitHub. This allows increased efficiency and productivity and giving rise to internal open source. So at Nordstrom, even it has really changed Nordstrom's culture as far as even internally there was we had an authentication helper tool written in Node, and we wanted to add a feature to it. Instead of going to that team and submitting a request and saying, hey, can you get to this sometime? We knew they were busy, and so we just fixed it and submitted a PR. They were able to review the PR and merge it. So even if you're not sort of doing external open source, that open source culture can really help you as an engineering org. So what's the bigger idea? So open source is people working together, building something greater that they can create on their own. I think that's the great thing about it. So thank you, and what questions can I answer for you guys?
What were the parties involved for the CCLA? I mean, who was signing it? Who was the authority on it and stuff? I was a little lost.
Yeah, totally. I ultimately signed it, which I was super uncomfortable with, but.
So is that between the employee and the company? Is it?
Yeah, sorry. So I'll explain that. So for example, when we bought Chef, we signed a corporate contributor license agreement, and we listed the names of employees who were authorized to contribute to Chef-maintained code. And so we had to maintain that list. So if you weren't on that list, then you were not approved to, I mean, it's easy to add people, but like I was a person who was managing that list of employees and saying, this person, so someone would contact me and say, I want to be added to the list of contributors license agreement, and I would add that person, and they would be authorized to contribute. But our legal team, during the contract negotiation with Chef, they got involved in that and contract review, and then they signed that. So ultimately, it's sort of saying, hey, we know that we're giving our code, our intellectual property, to Chef, and we're okay with that, and we understand what that means. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. In the Chef case, so I mean, how would it work for other open source projects like Nginx or something, or I mean? So
I don't know if Nginx has a contributor's license agreement process. I know that Facebook does because we signed it for React.js, and I know that Google does because we signed it for Kubernetes. So basically, what that means is they have a process, and in Google's case, you create this Google group and you add people to the group and whatever, but someone who has signing authority on behalf of the company, usually that's a director or something, needs to sign that. Is that? And I feel like I'm not getting to the root of your question.
I think I've got what I need.
Okay. And Wikipedia has a good article on it. I think Google has a really good explanation of what a CCLA is. So if you look at, if you Google corporate contributors license agreement, it's pretty easy to find, and they have probably the best explanation I've seen about what it is you're signing and why you need to sign it, what benefit it gives you.
Since signing these agreements, or since source and perhaps free software on occasion. Have you had confusion or wild success with employees who already had open source or free software projects?
What, so,
before they were hired?
sorry, what do you mean?
I mean, for example, if I came to work for Nordstrom,
Yep.
I've already got a couple of dozen old GitHub projects
Yep.
with various GPL and Apache and other licenses on them.
Yep.
Are your new employees carefully signing explicit licensing agreements to say, no, these are my licenses and not part of the corporate?
Right. Yeah. So I would. They should be, right? Yes.
Prior inventor.
Yeah. So I typically in intellectual, or I don't know. Typically, I don't know a ton about them, but the ones I've seen, you can list your sort of prior inventions or whatever as sort of being outside. So yeah, I don't know. I suspect that if people know to answer the right questions, then they'll ask those. I would guess that HR is not giving them a class on this or anything. I don't know, but yeah, that's something to watch out for sure.
So, Lauren, it sounds like you started first contributing back to Chef. Did it take much longer for you to actually open source your own projects and create your own kind of like, or how did that work? Like, was it harder to get Nordstrom to say, okay, we created this in-house product.
Yep.
We're gonna make that available to the community rather than just contributing back to already other companies' projects?
Yeah, I think one of our first contributions was Chef Vault.
Okay.
And that was, I think it was fairly, I definitely think that if we tried that right out of the gate, it might have been challenging, but I think there's sort of a progression, right? Get comfortable, the company needs to get comfortable with just using open source. And what I mean by that is not open source provided, so there's like open source provided by a vendor, like Red Hat, right? And then there's open source project, like Kubernetes or something that's backed by a company, but it's not like, you're not paying for it. Like it's real open source, I guess. And then there's sort of the next level is, hey, some person on the internet puts this in GitHub and it's getting some traction and I want to try it out, right? So that's sort of the using open source and then contributing back. I think like Chef was pretty easy because I think Chef was pretty good about explaining, hey, using community cookbooks, you're going to want to contribute back. And so we found out pretty quickly, like one of our Unix engineers did a ton of work on Solaris, and Chef, doesn't, they have some Solaris expertise, but like not as much as this guy. So he contributed quite a bit of Solaris stuff to Core Chef and to Chef Cookbooks because he had the domain expertise, he had the domain knowledge, and he had like Solaris boxes to test stuff on. So it was pretty easy to make a case to his manager, right? Like, hey, we need to add this Solaris support. Chef isn't going to do it, and so that would really help us if we can contribute that back, and then we don't have to maintain. So maintaining it private forks is a nightmare. So does that answer?
Yeah. So basically, like, kind of ease into it, maybe contribute back a little, and then say, hey, can we open source this project?
Right, and I think maybe like don't open source, like, if you're Tesla, you open source your patents, and that's crazy, right? But awesome. But as far as Nordstrom, like Chef Vault is a pretty easy case to make, right? It's not core to our like intellectual property. It's not core value chain. It's not, if we don't open source it, we can still sell shoes, right? So that's pretty far removed from like from a risk standpoint or whatever. And it would help a lot of people, and then we get contributions and it benefits a lot of people. For example, we open source ChefTK Bootstrap, which I maintain, and it basically bootstraps a laptop for chef development in about 20 minutes. And so that is something that like lots of people need to do, and we use it all the time. And that was our intern's project last summer, and she got a lot of benefit out of it too, because then she had something to show at the end of the summer to her friends, her professors, or whatever. And that generated a ton of goodwill at her school, and Chef ran a blog post about it, and we got a ton of goodwill out of that because that was, she did something meaningful and she was able to open source it, and she can, when she goes to a job interview, she's like, hey, this is this project I worked on, I contributed to it. It's on GitHub, you can go look at it. So, go ahead.
Quick question. So, I think this is great, what Nordstrom is doing, and it's great the fact that you guys are operating in a different space. A lot of us are in technology space, so I've worked at a company in the past where the legal team was very wary of granting a patent license in a space where we may have a patent already, or we may have one in the future.
Yep.
So, not all CLAs are created equal. And I was wondering if there's a, kind of a third party, just like you showed, the different license for the repos.
Yep.
If there are assessment of different CLAs out there.
It's a really good question. So obviously the answer is no, or I don't know about it. But here's what I did. We had already signed the Facebook CCLA, and so I took the text of the Facebook CCLA and I git diffed it against the Google CCLA, and they're basically identical except for the word Facebook is replaced by the word Google. And there's like 3 or 4 words that are added in the Facebook CCLA. But by diffing them, I was able to gain a lot of confidence and be able to talk to our contract review people and say, hey, these things are basically identical, and here's the git diff. They were a little confused by the git diff at first. But I was able to say, hey, look, they're identical, I diffed them. And so that made that process a lot easier. Like, hey, we've already gotten comfortable with the Facebook one, and the Google one is basically identical. So I don't know. I'm sure there are other CCLAs that, obviously it requires close legal review. I wouldn't say you should just sign it and don't worry about it. You need to review it for sure.
Yeah, because some of them you're actually giving a patent license. I'm not sure if the Google one has that.
Yeah, I think the Facebook CCLA, we can look at it. But I think it does you're granting a patent license. So yeah, I think anytime you're trying to open source, or you're proposing to open source something that's sort of core IP to your company, that's probably not going to fly, or not a good idea, or you have to be super careful, I think, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you have any tips for getting buy-in from the middle management level? Because culturally I've seen that developers and directors are both, open source, but the managers at that middle level are a bit more wary and a bit more focused on, I guess, their personal responsibilities and their team's responsibilities.
Sure.
So we've been having trouble getting more cultural buy-in at that middle level.
So I think the first thing to start with is start with listening and asking them what are they afraid of, or what are they worried about, or whatever. And then try to address do you have an idea of what they might be, what their concern might be?
I'm not sure it's wary. It might be more apathy.
Okay. Apathy, and would they care if you contributed to open source, or?
Apathy about open source.
Sure.
It doesn't really affect them, their mindset, and so they don't see, I guess, the benefit.
Sure. I think you have to sort of couch it in terms that they can relate to. I think if you are if you're on this open source crusade, whatever, then that's not gonna fly very well. But if you're more so, as an example, right, it's fairly easy to explain that maintaining private forks of open source code is a bad idea and will result in more work down the road. So that's sort of hey, we fixed Supermarket, for example, and that was easy to say, well, we could maintain a private fork, but that's kind of expensive and it's going to diverge upstream. And so the best thing for us to do is to fix that and then contribute it back. And now Chef gets to maintain it, even though we wrote it, right? So, so there's sort of that's sort of the way of maybe explaining it in a way that's helpful. So, yeah.
What are your thoughts on open source versus not so open source in terms of most of the open source companies use Jenkins, Chef or GitHub have their enterprise editions.
Yep.
These are, in some ways, for the lack of word, it's like hiding the. I isolating you from an open source world, right? Because you directly can't contribute into an enterprise edition stuff in many ways.
Sure.
And if you have bought into an enterprise edition, a lot of contributions to an open source world is anyway delayed.
Yep.
So,
Well, I think there's like, Chef is sort of open core, right? But we absolutely, we pay for Chef. I'm happy that we pay for Chef. I'm happy to give Chef money, right? We get outstanding support from Chef, and then the sort of features that they add on top of Chef Server or whatever, those are things that are valuable to us, right? And so I'm not an open source zealot. I think that, but Chef is sort of open core. There's a ton of open source in Chef and that's super valuable to us, that we can contribute and we can fix things and we can keep moving forward, and we can add Solaris support where we need to, because we need to maintain Solaris for our business, as an example or whatever, right? Does that make sense? So I think paying for software is.
it's not about paying for software. Obviously,
Yep.
I think we pay Chef too, so it's
Yep.
Fairly happy with it. But it's more about some of the benefits of open source in terms of the amount of contribution that rapidly increases when you actually make your project open source, right? Sort of goes away when you are on an enterprise edition, though it might, maybe I can equate this to GitHub, because we pay GitHub too, is the amount of features that go into GitHub open source is not equal to the number of features that go into a GitHub enterprise.
Yeah.
So the development on the enterprise is still far lesser than the complete open source versions.
Sure. I think you have to sort of weigh it against the benefits that you're getting, right? So you're able to run GitHub behind the firewall, and right, instead of paying them monthly to have private repos or whatever, so, and having your code out on the internet and things like that. So I think the benefits, like we went to Jenkins Enterprise and then we moved back to open source Jenkins. So I think you sort of weigh the benefits and see what you're getting into. Great time. One more, Julian.
Yeah. Hey, Doug. So in Habitat, we switched away from CCLAs and ICLAs, and we're using the developer certificate of origin now, which puts the onus on the individual to certainly have the right to.
Can I give you this microphone? Because I think what you're saying is super interesting, and I'd love to hear it, and it should go on the recording.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, for those who don't know me, I'm the product manager for Habitat, and we made a conscious choice. Listening to Doug talk about just a lot of the paperwork and bureaucratic challenges he had with the CCLA, which is something we've experienced with Chef originally. So when we launched Habitat, we made a very conscious decision to abandon the CLA process and use what they call a developer certificate of origin, which is what the Linux kernel uses. And it puts the onus on the individual to assert that what they're contributing is they have the right to be able to do that. They own the copyright, they didn't steal it from somewhere, and that, whatever other paperwork that they need to do upstream, they kind of did on their own, right? And basically what you do in the Git commit is you, as a developer, you put in signed off by, put your name and your email address, and that's it, right? So I'm just interested, Doug, in sort of your reactions, what you think your legal counsel might say, or might or might not have problems with this. So I'm just interested in those thoughts. Like, what would their reaction be to a project that's run with a DCO?
So I'm not going to try to predict what our legal team may or may not say. Yeah, I think we'd have to have a conversation with them. So yeah, I don't know. So sorry.